Welcome to the Praxology Podcast, where theology fuels the mission of the church. Our hope is to see the church in Central and Eastern Europe equipped to think biblically, reflect theologically, and act pastorally. I am Sean Smith with Tyler Patty, as always. We're excited to be in the studio again today to further the concept of theological education, connecting it with practice through hearing stories from, in some cases, the actual voices of ForMission college students from our Central and Eastern European campus. And just in summary of the first two episodes, before we get to that point, we've talked about critical reflection being the glue that holds theory, we can say orthodoxy, and practical things together, practical being the orthopraxis. And we'll see some concrete examples of that through local ministry examples today. So critical reflection is what helps us not only connect right belief with right practice and also living, but it transforms our abilities so that we can be faithful disciples of Jesus who do things proactively rather than just being reactive people in the world. So reflection helps us be able to participate and think ahead to address issues before major problems arise. Otherwise, we're simply passive observers going through ministry events and moving on to the next one because
somebody scheduled it.
Somebody scheduled it, right? Life is busy. Somebody else took control of my Google Calendar and put something there without my permission. But I have to do it, and I also want to do it, but there's still that busyness thing there. So there are easy ways to move toward being more reflective and proactive, of course. We mentioned the pastoral cycle being one of those things. In our last episode is a good exercise to deepen our thinking and further our action and practice in the world to be better pictures of God. But now I want to move us to see what some young missional leaders are doing with some questions that we asked them on the ground. And so what we did was we asked 4 questions to our students at ForMission College. And today we're going to look at their responses, some through audio, some through us just reading. But Tyler, explain to us how it's going to work.
Absolutely. Well, for some context first, one of the great things about ForMission College, Central and Eastern European campus in particular, but more broadly as well, is that our students are actually, they get credit for ministry. So each student, along with their studies, they actually half are required to do at least 12 hours of ministry a week, which is no small amount. It's not just like, I'm going to go be at youth group for 2 hours. It requires a lot of intentionality, and it gives them lots of experience in space as well. Mm-hmm. Now, I expect that our listeners, some of our listeners are also engaged in similar types of ministry. Our students, are involved in youth ministries, in evangelism, in pastoral work, in worship, in outreach, in experimental ministry avenues like on the online world, esports, e-gaming. Mm-hmm. And I expect that some of our listeners are in a similar spot, that you're devoting a lot of energy, a lot of time to your ministry. And we hope that this conversation will be helpful to you as you listen. So as Sean, you mentioned, we asked them 4 questions, and they're all related to the challenges involved in doing theological reflection in practice. When life is busy, when there's a student who really needs my attention, when there's an event that needs to be planned and is coming up way quicker than we expected, when, I just preached a sermon last week and now I have to get ready for another one next week. So how do we stay reflective in the middle of this? Mm-hmm. So we'll ask these questions, we'll hear the responses of our students, and we'll also stop and reflect together on some of the key themes that we're hearing. And some, maybe just to prime it as well, some of the things that we're going to talk about today are what's success? What does success look like in this kind of a discussion of theological reflection? What's kind of the best case scenario? Also, why might this be important? What's the fruit? How does this actually change things? And then, as we mentioned, how do we do this? How do we reflect? How do we think theologically when there's just so much to do? So I'm excited. Are you excited, Sean?
I'm excited. We'll just go ahead and jump right into the first question that we asked to our students. What are your biggest challenges in bringing together learning and practice? So similar themes to what we've talked about: orthodoxy, orthopraxis. It's a difficult word to say, but one consistent theme that we've heard rather over the course of time consistently. Biggest challenge in bringing together learning and practice is what we alluded to already. That B word, the busyness word, right? Oh, that just gets in the way of everything. And so ministry, Tyler mentioned 12 hours a week. A lot of students are doing considerably more than that in a lot of ways. So busyness with ministry, with school, perhaps even job on top of that, and finding time to slow down. It's like, I have to do all this stuff. People put it on my calendar. I put some of it on my calendar myself. I still have to do it. How do I slow down and rest? And then a secondary question, thankfully, that a lot of students are asking is also, how do I reflect at the same time? Like I've heard from several students, I wrote a thought down or a question to think about later, but I actually haven't had time to go back and think about that. So how do I do that moving forward? Really, really helpful question. And actually that student that I'm referencing now, his name is Max. He's in Germany, and we're going to hear a video clip of him now answering the question, what are your biggest challenges in bringing together learning and practice?
We've just recently learned about resting in connection with working in a ministry organization. And this is something that I'm already thinking of for quite a while, as I find it really hard to have these constant times of rest while I'm working, because I do really enjoy all the stuff that I'm doing, and I see that it's necessary to do it, but it's also important to have these times of rest.
Yeah, so within that, we're hearing there's often a phrase that's used called the tyranny of the urgent. And so Tyler, maybe talk a little bit about what that means and what you think of what Max has said here.
I really appreciate how Max is reflecting that there are things he wants to do. There are things that he's really excited about doing, things that need to be done because people need to hear the gospel and people need to grow and know God more. But it can often just be very overwhelming. And there's lots of ways that we could talk about this. I would just say that I read a book recently called The Patient Ferment of the Early Church. I like talking about this pretty much whenever I have the chance. It's basically
quite frequently.
Quite frequently, yes, in many conversations together. The patient ferment of the early church, and it looks at the church in the first 3-4 centuries, and basically asking the question: how did the church grow from this band of scrappy Jesus followers to the religion of the whole world, basically, with Emperor Constantine instituting it as the religion of the Roman Empire? How did it get that far in 4 centuries? And we might think, oh, they had a really worked out strategy of ministry. They were just working like crazy and just go, no stopping. That might be our strategy today. People need to hear the gospel. Let's go. We can't stop. No rest for the weary. But actually, this book argues that one of the markers of the early church was patience, that they were patient. They were not hurried because they were modeling their lives after the teachings of Jesus. For example, the Beatitudes: blessed are the poor, blessed are the hungry, blessed are those who thirst for righteousness. It's patience. It's realizing that God's kingdom is breaking in, and it's breaking in whether I work hard or not. It's God's work. It's God's kingdom. And I can turn the other cheek. I can forgive. I don't have to be rushed and hurried because God is working. And that's the other word in this book is ferment, that it's like fermentation. It's this energy that takes some time to build up. But once it's built, once it's growing, when you think about, fermenting wine or fermenting yeast to make bread, it's not the active yeast where you just put hot water on and it bubbles up in 2 minutes. But this is, natural yeast that maybe takes 12 hours to actually develop. But in the end, it's a much, much better kind of growth. So I think that we need to remember, we need to not be hurried, because Jesus also was not hurried. Jesus had a lot of work to do, and he still had time to pull away, spend time with the Father, pray. He had time to stop in the middle of a busy day and look someone in the eye and love them and respond to them, meet their needs, heal them, forgive them. So we do not need to be hurried.
Yeah, I'm stopping myself from so many stories, particularly from the Gospel of Mark, on how he emphasizes Jesus resting and Jesus slowing things down. More to come on that in next episode. But what we can say now is that we should enjoy the process of a slow fermentation, leading to fulfillment of our own goals, which are, as we're talking, more in line with the will of God, and reflective practice, being more conscious beings in the world, thinking, how am I relating God to somebody else? Slowing down and taking the time to say, I just had this meeting. What happened? Maybe I didn't come across how I wanted to. God, can you help me to change? So next time is different. Different in a good way. So it's a funny way to say it, enjoying the process of fermentation, but a good wine ferments for quite a while. And it goes through a nice process. And part of it is you can't hurry it because it's not going to taste very well.
Exactly.
And so you have to really slow down and enjoy that process of unhurriedness. And that allows us to be, if we're doing that correctly, rather than just, I don't know, taking naps 24/7 or something, it allows us to be more proactive instead of reactive in our ministries. And one very concrete thing that I do is, if I think of something, I'm reading a book, or maybe I'm reading the Bible for my own personal devotion, benefit, and gain, but I think of something because I'm teaching, like next week, or I have to have this conversation with this person tomorrow, and that stuff's in your mind. You can't take it out of your mind. So if I have a thought, I'm like, oh, that would be so good if I can add this part into my illustration for this teaching or something, I'll just write it down. And then it's put away. It's in a place for me to think about later. And I know myself, I forget things a lot for many reasons. So I counter that by putting it on my calendar. And I'll actually put a space on my calendar, 15-minute block, to actually just stop and think about the question that I wrote down, so that I have a safeguard in place so that I can actually utilize what I said, but not totally take away from the point of me reading the Bible in that moment.
Absolutely. And one thing that I don't know if, I think you tend to write notes in lots of different places. Is that true? Or do you have one central place that you write stuff down in?
Yes, I'm transitioning there.
Actually. Okay. Transitioning.
I have index cards that I have on my desk, and I have tons, and I've found that I end up not utilizing them as well as they could be. So I've gone to actually putting everything on my digital Google Calendar.
So everything in one place. So you don't have to think,
place.
where is that sticky note? Where is that scrap of paper? Putting it in one place so that then you can come back to it. That's really helpful.
Yeah.
That's great.
That's where I'm moving towards. Yeah.
Well, let's hear from Max one more time. And he's going to reflect on another challenge in bringing together his learning and his practice, which is the point.
That I'm facing at the moment when it comes to bringing what I've learned into my practical context is to explain people well what my opinion on things is, or why I've changed my view on stuff in German. As every language has its own DNA, and it's especially the technical terms are differently. So it is a little bit challenging to give a very valuable translation.
Great point. Language carries so much. And if you're learning about theology in English, for example, if you're listening to this podcast, we hope that your first language is not English. Actually, this podcast is for you. And we really encourage you to figure out how to translate what you're learning into your local language, and not only to your local language, but also to your context, how to apply it correctly. And that does not mean copy paste. It does not mean it's so easy to see a success story and think, oh, well, here, I'll just copy it right into my context without actually thinking, what might God be doing in here where I am? And it might look a little bit different.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is one area where I get particularly excited about. And if Tyler, you're mentioning this book on unhurriedness quite often. I'm probably also talking about what it means to learn theology and also teach it to other people quite often. So I think it's one thing to learn theology, but it's an entirely different set of skills to take that learning and put it into a local context in a way that makes sense for people. And so basically it's not just learning about theology to become a brain on a stick or sitting up in an ivory tower, useless to the rest of the world. It's totally a different thing to take those ideas and teach others to teach it to others. And so one way to do this is Steve Patty. Tyler's going to hold up the book for us. For those watching, you can see. Those listening, it's a small book by Steve Patty. It's called A View of Theological Education in Central and Eastern Europe, a 2015 report. A lot of things were done in that book. It's about 100 pages, very accessible, covering multiple countries here in Central and Eastern Europe. One of the major findings that they took out of it was something that I don't know if it's in the book this way, but I call it tiered theology. It has different, things have different tiers, like a huge a wedding cake. You think it has a smaller part on the top, and then it gets bigger and then bigger at the bottom. It would be like 3 different tiers. And so this is 3 different tiers of theological education cake, I suppose.
It's our theological education cake.
Yeah, it's might as well have our cake.
Or we could think of it as the 3 layers in a tiramisu, if we want to stay European in our analogies. Even
better, because that's my favorite. And so tier 1 is the, if you can picture at the top of the pyramid or the top part, or maybe that in the tiramisu example, I'm thinking, where would that actually be? But maybe we'll just take a pyramid or a triangle. Tyler's actually going to grab one for us that we actually have here in the studio. And so towards the top, I'm pointing here, the very, very top, there's not very much space there. And so not very many people can fit into that space. And so tier 1 becomes those who are theological experts. They tend to have PhDs, tend to teach in various schools. But as you're moving down, you have tier 2, which is sort of like the middle of the pyramid or the triangle. And so there's more space there. And those are various levels of educated leaders. Not all of these leaders went to school to be educated, but they've learned theology over the course of time. And then we have right below there, just your general Christian population who's they're learning theology from going to the services, from various church events, but they're just in the working world, and they're actually a majority of the church. And so the trick is, how do you take the knowledge in theology that's there in tier 1 and make it accessible and usable for tier 2, so they can the people who are leaders then can take that into tier 3 and teach that to other people.
Absolutely. I think the most helpful thing that you can do, with the more knowledge you gain and the more experience you gain as well, is to practice telling it to kids.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the best experiences for me as a theological educator is actually trying to explain things to my 5-year-old and 4-year-old son. Okay, let's talk about the Trinity. Mm-hmm. My 5-year-old asked me a great question one time. He said, "Well, Daddy, you talked about the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Are there 3 gods?" I was like, "That's a great question. Let's talk about that." No, mm-hmm. There's one God in 3 persons, and then we kind of break it down. Teaching kids is one of the best ways to work out actually how to make concepts more accessible.
Yeah, totally. And even some of the best theologians, the late R.C. Sproul is one that pops into my head. He resided in the state of Florida for quite some time. he wrote many children's books, and there's an art form to that. How do you take some really good theology and put it into a way that a 4-year-old or a 5-year-old can understand? And we're taking our son, our oldest child, through the shorter catechism, and it's asking questions like, similar to what Tyler, you were just saying, how many gods are there? The answer is one. But how do you put that in a way that's abstract and knowledge is good? How do you put things like that into a story? And people like R.C. Sproul and many others throughout history have been amazing theologians. You'd be surprised they actually wrote children's books, and some of them are just brilliant. And so one of those things is having the knowledge that's up here in the tier 1 level that I'm pointing to on the pyramid, and having a knowledge of the specific concrete situation and the people, and basically asking the question, which is a totally different skill set than I have the knowledge, but how is this knowledge going to make sense to this person? And people make sense of what's in their own head first. So if it's coming from outside externally, it's not going to make as much sense. If you can get them to think of the same thing, then they're going to remember it much longer term. This is scientifically rather proven. And so the challenge then is not just using the word. It's taking the word and knowing it so well, you can put that concept in a children's book.
Yeah, absolutely.
Or whatever necessary to move it forward. So that's something similar that can be used by pastors or leaders who might be in tier 2, we can say, to explain things to those who are perhaps in tier 3.
So what we're saying basically is that as we learn, we're going to need to figure out how to explain it in different terms to different types of people.
Exactly.
So that requires a lot of wisdom and also experience. It might take some time to figure that out. Mm-hmm. Well, let's move on to another question. Sean, what was the next question that we asked our students?
Our second question was, what have you put into practice from your studies so far? And we asked this question a lot. We don't like students to run away from, I've learned something. It's like, okay, it's like sort of in the Old Testament, true wisdom is knowledge put into practice. And so that's really the heart of this question. What have you put into practice from your studies so far? One student, who's a first-year student from the Czech Republic, said, I have learned several ways and perspectives on how to read and study the Bible. I have started reading 2 chapters every day and writing my observations, feelings, and perspectives on the following 3 questions. What I see, what I learn about God, and third, what I learn about myself. And then he's actually learned this. He's talked with another year 1 student who's said, well, why don't you try doing this? So he's actually connected with this other student, and I think they're actually reading the Bible together at some points now. And connected with this, another student, this is very much related to the Bible and how we read the Bible and understand it can help. He talks about the idea of metanarrative. So Tyler, can you read us his response and maybe tell us a little bit more about what does metanarrative mean?
Yeah, so I'll first define what meta-narrative means. So meta means like big picture, basically, and narrative is a story. So what's the big story of the Bible? It's easy to get lost if you remember the first time you picked up a Bible and tried to read it cover to cover. It's very easy to get lost in all the names and events and the different stories. But the meta-narrative asks the question: what's kind of the thread that runs throughout all these stories? What's it really about, and where is it actually going? And so we would say that the meta-narrative, there's lots of ways that you can describe the meta-narrative, but it's basically a story about God fixing what was broken by sending, by sending himself, really, by entering into the world, by working with people where they're at, and giving of himself most fully in the person of Jesus, and then giving his Spirit as well to restore all things back to how they were supposed to be, and also even better. It's about bringing all things together in Jesus ultimately. So that's the big picture story, and this is what Ermal from Albania says. He says, I've started to learn about the genre of a book, and I've started reading the Bible book by book in order to get a better understanding of the context of what I'm reading. I also have started to take a deeper missional approach to the youth ministry I serve in by considering how to get more connected to the community instead of only inviting young people to our meeting place. When it comes to youth ministry, often people picture the image that all you do there is play games and have fun. But as I am approaching the scriptures by having the metanarrative in mind, that which connects individual books of the Bible together, it's helping me to see more clearly how important and serious is the movement of God among young people today. On the other hand, reading the Bible book by book and having the metanarrative perspective, I see how incarnational God's approach to mission is. I see how big a difference the incarnational approach is making to youth ministry. Instead of waiting for young people to come and find us when we hide inside the comfort of our church walls, we're reshaping the way we do ministry here in Vlor, Albania, by integrating ourselves more into the community, to what the youth like the most, and by taking the good news to them where they are. We now go and organize sports activities in the local gym, go out for coffee with them, organize picnics, do book clubs, etc. And that's the end of the quote. Great things, great reflection. So seeing who God is through his story, and then saying, if we're the people of this God, we need to do things like he did and like he does by entering into the hard places and really, as we talked about earlier, being an accurate picture of God to the lost world.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things you mentioned at the outset of this episode was talking about goals, and it's very clear. Ermal's goal is to be the best picture of God possible in his context, and so he's realized part of that means my view of the Bible doesn't necessarily need to change, but it needs to grow and expand so that I can connect, so that I can serve and be more like Christ. So it's truly an amazing picture there of theology and the Bible directly being put into practice in not only a concrete way, but also you can just sense the humility that he has for wanting to serve our Lord well.
Absolutely.
So another one of our students, this time from the Czech Republic, he says this about application of the Bible. He basically says he's learned how to plan better and be more systematic in ministry, but it has also learned personally from facilitators, teachers, on the idea of 2 Corinthians 10:5, which is the verse that talks about taking every thought captive. It's a very abstract and almost philosophical thing to say. But here's what he has to say about this verse, 2 Corinthians 10:5, taking every thought captive. After talking about it in the context of ForMission, the theme of this verse appears in my life throughout the rest of the year. I would walk in my city and have a negative thought come to mind. I learned to say it out loud, which is a very wise thing to do, just to say something out loud. It's like automatically it just has less power, just in and of itself. So he says it out loud, and he gives it to Christ. And when I asked him how this changes his local ministry, it's one thing to, I do that. So how does this change your local ministry? He says this. It kind of helped me to understand that if some thought comes into my mind, that it doesn't mean I have automatically sinned. The thing is what I do with that thought, if I give it to Christ or not. It changed my perspective of how I view myself and has allowed me to walk in freedom. Now if I'm with someone somewhere, if some judgmental thought, negative thought comes to mind, I recognize those things and I give them to Christ. I do not allow these thoughts to grow and create damage, which gives me capacity to love the other person. So it's a powerful testimony here of growth in personal ministry that affects discipleship, overall on the ground. Moving to then now to the third and the fourth questions that we had for our students. The third one was, how has theological reflection helped you discern what God is doing in your context? And Tyler, before I kick it back over to you, the same student that I was just reading from, he says this on this question. It's helping me to be more sensitive and careful to what people say around me, and also to see what my disciples feel and think. I am one of them. It's good to remember. I am a disciple too. So if I learn to reflect about my thoughts and feelings, I am better able to understand others better. It's an interesting thought. If I understand myself, then I'm also influencing discipleship relationship and affecting others. He also says, I've had many conversations with this. No, that was the end of his quote. My apologies. He says, I'm better able to understand others better. And I've personally had conversations with this student, and he's really started to grasp the purpose of the pastoral cycle that we mentioned, of putting it into actual practice and continually reflecting on what's going on. And he's becoming more proactive instead of, I guess we could say, reactive, and using every experience and going, where can I learn from this, Jesus? I want to grow, which is you just can't teach that kind of an impulse. We're truly blessed with students that have these kinds of impulses.
Absolutely. We have some incredible students. The fourth question and final question that we asked was, what kind of questions do students have about reflection, theology, and practice?
Just a few.
It's a very broad question. And I just wanted to say, you listeners might have questions. After this episode, I'd encourage you to actually write them down. As we were encouraging one another earlier, that if an idea pops into your head, if you're like, oh, I need to follow up on that later, or I had an idea, or this was a really interesting thought I want to come back to, please write that down, because we don't want to let those opportunities to learn and to reflect slip by. Mm-hmm. So, but here are some consistent themes. One was that they need more examples, more good examples of how does this actually work in practice. Who are leaders that are connecting theory, theology, and practice well? I think that's what we're hoping for, that we see more and more of this actually happening. And it is happening, but sometimes it is hard to see because reflection is kind of an internal experience. And it would be great if people shared more stories of what works well, and not just, oh, I had an idea and I tried this, but I'm actually discerning and reflecting on what God's doing and then responding to that. Another theme that we heard a few times from a few people is something along these lines. I'm excited about learning and seeing in the Bible and how it relates to the church, but when I try to do something, people are skeptical or unsure. How can I start a dialogue or a conversation about these things in the church to bring about change in places, but in other places bring about more critical reflection about the good things that are happening? Mm-hmm. So this is really just related to how do we start conversations with people? Maybe I'm a leader on a team. Maybe I'm not the main leader. Maybe I'm just a leader, or maybe I'm just a team member. How do I start a conversation that helps us all to maybe stop, to not be so hurried, to ask some good questions, to celebrate what's working well and the things that make sense, the ways that we are reflecting God well, and then how do we start conversations where we can actually have an honest look at what we're doing and what we're believing and say, maybe we need to grow. That's hard. That's a great question. How do we reflect as the church and in our teams? Mm-hmm. So we're going to save some of these topics for later episodes, because these are absolutely worth exploring more.
Yeah, and in terms of the big key themes that we've heard is really busyness of ministry. How do I have time to rest? How do I have time to reflect? We're going to revisit those things future episodes, and also this idea of how do we start conversations with people, and maybe drawing us to a close. Just an example of a church that I was a part of after what I'm about to describe had already taken effect. And so the leader of this church previously had the view that the gifts of the Holy Spirit had ceased. They no longer exist because the Bible, in terms of the actual canon of Scripture, is completed. And with that, all of the gifts ceased, 1 Corinthians type of gifts. he read a book. It's called Showing the Spirit by D.A. Carson, which is an exposition of 1 Corinthians 12, I do believe. And he changed his opinion. And so he said, I'm the pastor of this church. Like, my church doesn't currently hold that as a value. We don't practice the gifts. We never we have a firm belief on them, but I've changed my opinion. That's a humble leader, right? To not only go, that's true, but to actually act on it and do something. And what he did was he went to the rest of the elders. I don't know how many there were, not too many. And he's, guys, I think I've changed my view on this. I want to have a conversation. And so he just simply said, I think this is what's happening. I want to see what God might be doing in that, not just in me, but also through our church. And he sort of was testing the theory. Like he had changed his opinion. His mind was more firm going in the gifts do continue now, but willing to subject that to a process in the church and saying, if this is valuable, whatever is good, whatever is noble, whatever is pure, think on such things. Philippians, I do believe, in having conversation in the church. And that led to the leadership team going, yeah, I think this is right. And so they ended up moving in a direction of practicing gifts, and they're still working through this. But they ended up having a conversation with the broader congregation and inviting theological discussion about very key topics of Scripture and how the Bible is put together and how that works in the overall metanarrative, and ultimately change their view. This is a humble leader. I think of this story often. I'm going, man, I want to be as humble as that in my own ministry. This is just one example that comes to mind of starting a conversation, and that was an easy conversation to start. Hey, elder team, I've changed my opinion. What do we think about this? So maybe it could be that simple, or it could be, I learned something about the meta-narrative of the Bible. Instead, I'm going to use the concept instead of the word meta-narrative, because not everybody needs to know the word meta-narrative, but how it works, we can talk about that, and that makes sense to people. And so maybe the people in tier 1 of our pyramid need that language. Some in tier 2, but tier 3. Does the word meta-narrative, what do you think, Tyler? Do people in the tier 3, just regular congregation, need to know the word meta-narrative?
I don't imagine so. I don't think it adds that much value.
I think it takes too much cognitive effort to go, oh, what does that term mean again? Rather than just explaining the concept.
That's right.
So for future episodes on that, starting conversations, there's so much more we could talk about, right?
There is. And we will. There's lots that we will pick back up on. So, Sean, why don't you close us here? Yeah, we hope you've enjoyed hearing from voices, some that we've read, some that you've actually heard from Central and Eastern Europe on challenges to ministry, how to build reflective ministry into practice. We've tried to draw a couple of those things out. If one of the questions that we actually asked to our ForMission students really stuck out to you, like Tyler said, we want to hear it. So hopefully you wrote it down and take that extra step, write it to us. And if you do so, you can write it to us at Praxology, Praxologie at ForMission, ForMission.org.uk. Lots of letters.
A lot of letters. That's a long email address. But we would love for you to take that step to write what you're thinking to us. We also want to hear some stories. If you're like, what you were talking about reminded me of this. Give us some of those stories like Tyler was saying as well. So in upcoming episodes, we're going to continue discussing some of these themes. But for next episode, we will talk about one thing that just doesn't always get much attention when talking about missional leadership. But if we do this one thing and we can do it well, then it actually can help us to build a reflective culture in the church to start those conversations like we were just talking about. So once more, write to us if you have thoughts on these things. And if you like Praxology, if you like what we're doing here, hit the subscribe button so you can stay up to date with us on future episodes and what we are what we were talking about so you can join the conversation. And we'll see you in next episode on the Praxology podcast, where theology fuels the mission of the church. Once again, we just want to say blessings to you, and may God enrich our hearts and our minds in Christ Jesus for gospel works. We'll see you next time.
See you next time.